Trust no one. Those were the words John D. Rockefeller lived by, forged in the shadow of a father called Devil Bill, a wanted man with a dozen aliases and a trail of indictments. From this fractured family, the Rockefellers would build not just wealth, but a vast empire, Standard Oil, that, by 1879, controlled nearly every pipeline in America and rewrote the rules of business domination. Their rise became America's empire of oil and influence, a story marked by ruthless ambition, moral hypocrisy, and power that reached far beyond the oil fields. But behind every fortune, there lurks a secret. What was the real price of this empire, and who paid for it? William Avery Rockefeller, known in every county as Devil Bill, lived by deception. He drifted from town to town under false names, selling miracle cures and vanishing whenever the law closed in. In 1849, an indictment for rape sent him fleeing New York State, leaving behind a wife, children, and a trail of unpaid debts. Letters from the time record Eliza, his wife, swearing under oath that her husband had absconded and could not be found. Bill resurfaced as Dr. William Livingston in Illinois, raising a second family in secret, his double life shielded by aliases and lies. Inside the Rockefeller home, trust was a lesson taught by betrayal. Devil Bill would call young John to leap into his arms, catching him again and again, until one day, he let the boy fall hard. "Never trust anyone completely, not even me," Bill told his son. John learned early that promises could be traps, and that every agreement carried a hidden cost. Bill boasted that he traded with the boys and skinned them, teaching his children to expect a world of sharp dealings and double crosses. Even John's first business venture, a produce partnership, began with a loan from his father, at 10% interest, payable on time. Yet the other presence in John's childhood was his mother, Eliza. A devout Baptist, she demanded strict tithing from every penny the children earned or found. She led prayers at dawn, drilled thrift and duty into their daily routine, and kept the family afloat through her husband's absences and scandals. John watched her stretch coins, nurse neighbors, and forgive transgressions that would have broken most families. She believed that wealth, if it came, was a gift to be stewarded with discipline and piety. From these two poles, his father's cunning and his mother's faith, John D. Rockefeller absorbed a code built on secrecy, calculation, and outward respectability. He grew into a boy who trusted no one, who wrote every transaction in a ledger, and who learned to wear a mask of rectitude even as he plotted his next move. The contradictions of his childhood would not fade. They would become the blueprint for an empire. In January 1870, John D. Rockefeller and his partners incorporated Standard Oil in Ohio. The company began with a single refinery on the banks of the Cuyahoga River, but Rockefeller's ambitions stretched far beyond the city limits. Within 5 years, Standard Oil had absorbed or outmaneuvered dozens of local rivals, using a mix of relentless negotiation, precise bookkeeping, and quiet intimidation. Rockefeller's strategy was simple in principle, but ruthless in practice. Buy up the most efficient refineries, cut costs to the bone, and use scale to force down prices. Any competitor who refused to sell faced a relentless price war, often ending in bankruptcy or a reluctant handshake across the table. The real breakthrough came not in the refinery, but in the pipes beneath the ground. By 1879, Standard Oil controlled nearly every major pipeline in the United States. This network allowed Rockefeller to dictate the flow of crude oil from the wells to the refineries, and from the refineries to the railroads. Pipeline control meant that rivals could be cut off from supply overnight, their output stranded, their credit evaporating as bankers and oilmen alike realized the balance of power had shifted. Standard's grip on transportation became a weapon as effective as any contract or court order. The pace of expansion was dizzying. Standard Oil's share of the refining market soared, and by the end of the decade, the company handled the vast majority of oil passing through Cleveland and beyond. Rockefeller, once the cautious son of a confidence man, now operated with the precision of a chess master, always thinking several moves ahead. Every pipeline acquired, every refinery brought under the Standard banner, tightened his command over the industry. The company's rise was not a matter of chance or luck, but of relentless calculation and a willingness to do whatever was required to win. The first seeds of America's oil empire had been planted, and their roots were already strangling the competition. In late 1871, a quiet agreement was drafted in boardrooms hundreds of miles from the oil fields. The South Improvement Company Pact, signed in secrecy by Standard Oil, and a handful of railroad executives, set out terms that would tilt the entire industry. Under its provisions, Standard Oil and a select few allies would receive deep rebates on every barrel shipped, amounting to a hidden discount that slashed their costs far below any competitor's reach. The pact also guaranteed Standard a share of the inflated rates paid by its rivals, turning the railroads into silent partners in Rockefeller's campaign for control. The arrangement was designed to be invisible. Contracts were kept out of public filings, and the language of the agreements was cloaked in legal jargon. But in February 1872, a railroad circular leaked. News spread fast through Cleveland and the Pennsylvania oil regions. Rates would rise for independent refiners on February 17th, with only Standard and its chosen partners spared. Panic set in almost overnight. Letters between refinery owners and bankers from that week describe a sense of betrayal, as the realization dawned that the cost of shipping oil would suddenly jump for everyone outside the circle. For many, the numbers spelled ruin. Shipments that once turned a modest profit now guaranteed a loss. Meetings erupted in oil towns as owners scrambled for information. Some tried to negotiate with the railroads, only to be shown the door. Others appealed to their banks for emergency lines of credit, but found those doors closing as well. Many bankers had been quietly offered Standard Oil stock, and now saw their own interests tied to Rockefeller's fortunes. The infrastructure of American industry, built on rails and trust, had been weaponized against the very men who depended on it to survive. The pact's exposure did not end the threat. Instead, it triggered a wave of forced sales and closures. Owners faced a stark choice: accept Standard's offer, often at a fraction of their refinery's value, or risk being cut off from both transportation and capital. The South Improvement Company had turned the arteries of commerce into levers of control, and for those on the outside, the message was unmistakable: join or be left behind. The panic of February 1872 would become the opening act in Standard Oil's most aggressive campaign of consolidation. As Rockefeller's agents moved from boardroom to boardroom, ledger in hand, ready to absorb or eliminate the competition. In the weeks that followed the South Improvement Company leak, Cleveland's oil industry became a battlefield. On February 21, 1872, John D. Rockefeller and his lieutenants began moving from office to office, contracts in hand. Their offers were not invitations, but ultimatums. Owners could accept a quick payout, cash, or Standard Oil stock, almost always at a fraction of their refinery's value, or face the prospect of bankruptcy. The terms were spelled out in model contracts, each clause drafted to favor Standard's consolidation. Some owners tried to negotiate. Most found there was little room to bargain. Pressure came from every direction. Banks, once reliable sources of credit, began turning away long-standing customers. Depositions from the time reveal that bankers, now holding Standard Oil shares themselves, refused to extend loans to any refinery outside the fold. One manager, John Alexander, described being told bluntly, "You will find no credit in this town unless you join the combination." By the end of February, the first wave of sales was complete. Names that had once dominated Cleveland's oil trade, Clark, Payne and Company, Schofield, Schirmer, and Teagle, signed over their assets for sums that barely covered recent investments. Some owners accepted Standard Oil shares, hoping to salvage a future in the new order. Others took cash and walked away, defeated. A handful tried to hold out, only to discover that railroads had stopped delivering crude to their plants. Shipments vanished mid-route, with railroad memos citing new policies that favored Standard's contracts. For those who resisted, the message was unmistakable: cooperate or collapse. The pressure mounted as March began. On March 5th, Rockefeller penned a memo to his partners. "Our combination must proceed quickly, before undue public scrutiny and panic can overturn advantage. Complete negotiations within 8 days." The pace accelerated. By March 10th, 18 of Cleveland's 22 major refineries had sold or closed. The remaining few faced shuttered doors and empty tanks. Bankers, merchants, even former colleagues urged them to accept Rockefeller's terms before there was nothing left to sell. Behind closed doors, some owners wept as they signed. Others signed in silence, knowing the fight was lost. In just 6 weeks, Standard Oil had transformed Cleveland's oil business from a patchwork of independent firms into a single, tightly controlled monopoly. The speed and finality of the takeover sent shockwaves through the city. Rumors of coercion and betrayal began to spread, setting the stage for a public backlash that would soon echo far beyond Ohio. In 1882, Standard Oil's operations underwent a transformation that would baffle even seasoned attorneys. Rather than a single corporation, the empire was split across 41 companies, each nominally independent but bound together by a single trust deed. The legal document, drafted in secrecy, transferred the stock of each company to 9 trustees, men whose names rarely appeared in the press, yet whose signatures authorized every major decision. These trustees, acting as a shadow board, could shift assets, set prices, and dictate policy for all constituent firms, while maintaining the appearance of separation. The trust's architecture was crafted to frustrate regulators and journalists alike. Corporate charters were scattered across state lines: Ohio, New York, New Jersey, each with its own set of filings and requirements. Ownership records were buried in layers of proxies and holding companies. Even when a state attorney general demanded disclosure, Standard could point to the paperwork and insist that each company was run independently, with no evidence of a monopoly on the books. Rumors of overseas manipulation began to circulate as rivals in Europe and Mexico reported unexplained setbacks. In one notorious case, a competitor's pipeline in Veracruz was found sabotaged, its valves jammed with sand and iron filings. Local police suspected hired hands, but nothing could be traced back to Standard or its American agents. The company's official stance was one of ignorance, while internal correspondence, later uncovered in federal investigations, revealed a pattern of deniable operations intended to disrupt foreign challengers. Within the United States, the trust structure allowed Standard to coordinate strategy without ever appearing as a single, accountable entity. Trustees could order a refinery in Pennsylvania to undercut prices in Kansas, or direct a pipeline in Indiana to halt shipments to a rival, all without any public record of collusion. The true levers of power were hidden, and the men who pulled them rarely left fingerprints. By the end of the decade, calls for a federal watchdog grew louder, as state regulators found themselves unable to pierce the corporate veil. The trust had become a fortress, its walls built not of stone, but of legal abstraction and deliberate confusion. In November 1902, a series of articles began to appear in McClure's magazine under the byline of Ida Minerva Tarbell. The daughter of a Pennsylvania oilman, ruined by Standard's tactics, Tarbell brought a personal edge to her reporting. She spent 2 years interviewing former rivals, poring over court records, and tracing the labyrinth of trusts and subsidiaries that shielded Standard Oil's true reach. Her investigation revealed that by the turn of the century, Standard controlled nearly 90% of America's oil refining, a figure that dwarfed even the most alarming rumors. Tarbell's prose was measured but relentless. She detailed secret rebates, the coercion of small refiners, and the elaborate legal maneuvers that kept the company's power hidden from public view. She quoted contracts and board minutes, exposing the shadowy architecture behind the trust. Readers were stunned by her account of how entire towns were brought to heel, their economies bent to Rockefeller's will by pipeline closures and credit cutoffs. Letters poured into McClure's from across the country, many from former refinery owners and their families, confirming Tarbell's findings and adding new stories of intimidation and ruin. Editorials in major newspapers soon echoed her outrage, demanding action from Congress and the courts. Tarbell's serialized exposé, later published in 1904 as The History of the Standard Oil Company, became a national sensation. Her reporting did what years of rumor and suspicion could not. It gave the public a clear target for their anger and forced politicians to confront the reality of Standard's hidden empire. The outcry fueled a wave of antitrust sentiment, and within months, state and federal investigators began to probe Standard Oil's operations in earnest. For the first time, the company's aura of invincibility began to crack under the weight of public scrutiny and moral condemnation. In 1906, the United States government filed suit against Standard Oil under the Sherman Antitrust Act. The case, United States versus Standard Oil Company of New Jersey, began in the Federal District Court of St. Louis, drawing national attention as attorneys presented thousands of pages of evidence, contracts, correspondence, and testimony from former partners and rivals. The hearing stretched on for nearly 5 years, with government lawyers arguing that Standard Oil's trust structure and coordinated subsidiaries constituted an illegal restraint of trade. Internal company memos and board minutes, subpoenaed for the record, revealed a web of secret agreements and price-fixing tactics that had allowed Standard to dominate the industry for decades. John D. Rockefeller, by then in semi-retirement, remained the public face of the company, even as he claimed to have ceded daily control. His reputation, carefully cultivated over a lifetime, was subjected to cross-examination in the court of public opinion. Newspapers published daily updates, dissecting the testimony of Standard's executives and the government's expert witnesses. The proceedings exposed the scale of the trust's influence. By 1904, Standard Oil controlled 90% of U.S. refining and a vast network of pipelines, tank cars, and foreign subsidiaries. Yet, as the trial unfolded, Standard's lawyers argued that the company's size alone was not proof of wrongdoing. They cited falling kerosene prices, improved efficiency, and the creation of new jobs as evidence that the public had benefited from Standard's methods. The legal battle reached its climax on May 15, 1911, when the Supreme Court delivered its decision. In a 21,000-word opinion, the court found that Standard Oil's combination of companies amounted to an unreasonable monopoly in restraint of interstate commerce. The justices ordered the dissolution of the trust, mandating that its 34 constituent companies become independent entities. These included the future giants of American oil, Standard Oil of New Jersey, later Exxon, Standard Oil of New York, later Mobil, Standard Oil of California, later Chevron, and others. Shares in these companies were distributed among existing Standard Oil stockholders, including the Rockefeller family. Paradoxically, the breakup unleashed a financial windfall for John D. Rockefeller and his heirs. As the value of the separated companies soared on the stock market, Rockefeller's personal fortune doubled within a few years. The ruling, intended to curb the power of a monopoly, instead cemented the family's wealth for generations. The courtroom defeat did not erase the legacy of Standard Oil's dominance, but it did signal the end of an era. The government's intervention demonstrated that even the most powerful corporate empire could be brought to heel by the law, at least in form. Yet, as the dust settled, former Standard Oil companies continued to shape the global oil market, now competing as separate giants rather than a single trust. The question of whether democracy had truly tamed monopoly power lingered, unresolved, as new arenas of influence beckoned for the Rockefeller dynasty. After the Supreme Court ordered the breakup of Standard Oil in 1911, the Rockefeller name did not fade from public life. Instead, the family's wealth and connections found new channels, reaching into the heart of American government and global affairs. Nelson Rockefeller, born in 1908, would become the most politically ambitious of his generation. Serving as governor of New York from 1959 to 1973, Nelson wielded executive power over the nation's most populous state, shaping policies on education, urban development, and public health with a scale and confidence that echoed the corporate dominance of his forebears. His tenure was marked by sweeping infrastructure projects and a willingness to deploy state resources to confront social unrest, often drawing both praise and controversy. Yet Nelson's ambitions extended far beyond Albany. In 1974, he was appointed Vice President of the United States under Gerald Ford, a position he held until 1977. White House records and contemporaneous press accounts reveal that Nelson's influence reached deep into national security and foreign policy deliberations. His private correspondence with State Department officials and energy executives, now preserved in public archives, points to a network in which political office and corporate interest were often closely entwined. Nelson's role in shaping America's response to the 1973 oil embargo is especially noteworthy. As OPEC nations imposed supply cuts, internal memos and Aramco board minutes show that Rockefeller-linked companies, including Exxon and Mobil, were central to back-channel negotiations with Saudi Arabia. Declassified cables between U.S. envoys and Saudi officials reference Rockefeller intermediaries, suggesting that the family's reach extended into the highest levels of global energy diplomacy. The Rockefeller connection to Middle Eastern oil was not new. Since the 1930s, family interests had played a pivotal role in securing access to Saudi reserves, working alongside the State Department to engineer the original Aramco concessions. By the time of the 1973 crisis, these relationships had matured into a web of personal and institutional ties, blurring the line between private wealth and public policy. Board minutes from the period record discussions, in which Rockefeller representatives weighed the risks of embargo, currency instability, and shifting alliances, often with the tacit understanding that their advice would shape official U.S. positions. Nelson's ascent to the vice presidency brought the family's influence into the open, fueling debate over the proper boundaries of power in a democracy. Critics charged that the Rockefellers had parlayed their oil fortune into a shadow government, able to steer both domestic policy and international strategy from behind closed doors. Supporters countered that Nelson's experience and connections were assets in a time of crisis. The evidence, found in a trove of official documents and private letters, reveals a pattern. The Rockefeller dynasty, once confined to the boardroom, had become an invisible hand in the corridors of state. The legacy of Standard Oil now played out on the world stage, as the family's pursuit of influence moved from pipelines and refineries to the machinery of government itself. In 1913, the Rockefeller Foundation was chartered in New York, its endowment drawn from the fortune amassed by Standard Oil. The stated aim was to promote the well-being of humanity, but the early years of the foundation were defined as much by controversy as by charity. Trustees, including John D. Rockefeller Sr. and his son, John D. Rockefeller Jr., directed vast sums toward public health, medical research, and education. The foundation funded campaigns against hookworm in the American South, established schools of public health at Johns Hopkins and Harvard, and sent grants to scientific institutions across the globe. These efforts were widely praised in annual reports and the national press as evidence that the family's wealth could serve the common good. Yet, behind the rhetoric of uplift, the foundation's money also flowed into projects that would later provoke public outrage. In the 1910s and 1920s, the Rockefeller Foundation became a leading patron of eugenics research, supporting studies at Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory, and underwriting international conferences on hereditary science. Foundation grants helped finance the Eugenics Record Office, which promoted policies of selective breeding and compulsory sterilization. Letters between trustees and scientific advisors from this period show a deliberate effort to frame eugenics as a tool for social improvement, couched in the language of efficiency and public health. The contradiction was stark. On one hand, the Foundation's campaigns saved lives and advanced medicine. Its support for yellow fever research, for instance, contributed to breakthroughs that transformed global health. On the other, its backing of eugenics lent scientific credibility to policies that would later be condemned as violations of basic human rights. By the late 1920s, as news of forced sterilizations and racial quotas reached the public, the Foundation faced growing criticism from journalists, clergy, and reformers. Internal memos, preserved in the Rockefeller archives, record anxious discussions among trustees about the reputational risks of continued association with eugenics. Some urged a quiet withdrawal. Others argued that the Foundation should defend its record as progressive science. The backlash was not limited to eugenics. Critics charged that the Rockefeller Foundation's scale and selectivity gave it undue influence over the priorities of American science and education. Decisions about which universities, hospitals, and laboratories would receive funding were made in private meetings with little public oversight. Congressional hearings in the 1930s questioned whether such concentrated philanthropy amounted to a new form of private government, one that could shape the nation's future without democratic accountability. The Foundation's leaders responded by emphasizing transparency and public benefit, but the tension between altruism and control remained unresolved. By the eve of World War II, the Rockefeller Foundation had become the model for modern philanthropy, global in reach, scientific in method, and controversial in its power. Its legacy was already double-edged, celebrated for its generosity, scrutinized for its ambitions. The question of whether vast charitable wealth could ever be separated from the interests and agendas of its donors would continue to shadow the Rockefeller name for generations. In September 2014, the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, descendants of John D. Rockefeller's original fortune, announced it would begin divesting its $860 million endowment from fossil fuels. The move was phased, targeting coal and tar sands first, then broader oil and gas holdings. By 2010, Rockefeller Family Fund followed, publicly divesting from ExxonMobil and denouncing the company for what they called climate misinformation. These decisions made headlines, not for their financial impact, but for their symbolism. The heirs of America's oil dynasty turning away from the very industry that built their name. At press conferences and in interviews, family spokespeople argued that if John D. Rockefeller were alive, he would have recognized the business logic in abandoning fossil fuels for renewable energy. The statements were calculated, echoing the language of stewardship and adaptation, but also drawing a line between past and present. The response was immediate and polarized. Financial analysts debated the practical effects, but online forums and comment sections swelled with speculation. For some, the divestment was proof of a moral reckoning, a family atoning for the environmental costs of its empire. For others, it was seen as a strategic retreat, a way to protect wealth and reputation as fossil fuels lost their cultural and economic cachet. Yet, beneath the surface, a different conversation took hold. In the echo chambers of conspiracy podcasts and social media threads, the Rockefeller name remained a lightning rod. The family's philanthropic foundations, their public health campaigns, even their support for climate action, were recast as evidence of a hidden agenda. Theories about a deep state, a secretive elite steering world events, latched onto the Rockefeller legacy, weaving together fragments of truth with layers of suspicion. The family's historical involvement in the Council on Foreign Relations and the Trilateral Commission, both long-standing targets of anti-globalist rhetoric, were cited as proof of coordinated influence. David Rockefeller's 2002 memoir, in which he sardonically acknowledged accusations of global ambition, became a favorite quote for theorists convinced of a shadow government. Mainstream historians and journalists have found little evidence for such claims, noting that the Rockefeller family's direct influence has waned since the late 20th century. Still, the persistence of these narratives speaks to a deeper unease, the sense that vast, inherited fortunes can shape society in ways that are hard to trace, much less hold to account. The divestment from oil, if anything, amplified the debate. Was this the closing of an era, or simply a rebranding of old power under new slogans? For every statement about business foresight or moral progress, there remained a countercurrent of distrust. In the public imagination, the Rockefellers continue to occupy a space somewhere between legacy and conspiracy, their story unfinished, their motives constantly reinterpreted. The question of what, if anything, the family owes to the nation, whose resources built its fortune, remains as unsettled as ever. By 1911, the Supreme Court ordered the breakup of Standard Oil into 34 companies, but John D. Rockefeller's fortune only grew. Documents show the family's influence shifted from oil fields to public office and philanthropy. Nelson Rockefeller served as New York governor for 14 years and vice president from 1974 to 1977. The Rockefeller Foundation, established in 1913, funded both medical breakthroughs and controversial eugenics research. In 2016, official records confirmed the family's historic divestment from fossil fuels. Yet, the full extent of their behind-the-scenes power remains shielded by private correspondence and classified files. While the Rockefellers' name is found on hospitals and universities around the world, critics still debate whether their legacy is one of public good or private control. What is certain, the shadows of their decisions continue to shape American industry, politics, and philanthropy to this day.